This is Manisha Tamandular from Introduction to Contemporary History of Korea. So today I am going to present about Korean nationalism. It's in reading to page 28 to 34. So I'm going to talk about how Korean got independence movement, which was started from March 1, 1999. And I will also talk about Japanese occupation, why Japan ruled over Korea, how Japan ruled over the decades, when it happened, what did Japanese did to the Korean, and how Korean got the independence. So let's start from the background. So here are my contents. I'm going to talk about this topic today. So between 1910 and 1945, the Empire of Japan placed Korea under Japanese rule or Japanese occupation. Joseon Korea had become into the Japanese sphere of influence with the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876 and a complex coalition of the Meiji government, military and business officials, which began a process of integrating the Korean Peninsula's politics and economy with Japan. The Korean Empire, proclaimed in 1897, became a protectorate of Japan with the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1905. Thereafter, Japan ruled the country indirectly through the Japanese Resident General of Korea. Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910 in the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1910 without the consent of the former Korean Emperor Kojong, the regent of the Emperor Seongjong. The Japanese Empire had established the Korean Peninsula as a colony of Japan administered by the Governor-General of Chosun, based in Keijo, which governed Korea with near absolute power. Japanese rule prioritized Korea's Japanization, accelerating the industrialization started by the Hwangmu Reform of 1897 to 1907, building the public works and fighting the Korean independence movement. So, why Japan did that to the Korea? In order to establish control over its new protectorate, the Empire of Japan waged an all-out war on Korean culture. Schools and universities forbade speaking Korean and emphasized manual labor and loyalty to the emperor. Public places adopted Japanese too, and an edict to make films in Japanese soon followed. In 1910, Korea was annexed by the Empire of the Japan after years of war. In intimidation and political mechanism, the country would be considered a part of Japan until 1945. In order to establish control over its new protectorate, the Empire of Japan waged an all-out war on Korean culture, and as well as schools and universities forbade speaking Korean and emphasized manual labor and loyalty to the emperor. Public places adopted Japanese, and it also became the crime to teach the history from non-approved text, which was the Japanese language text, and the authorities won over the 2,200,000 Korean historical documents. They all were burned by the Japanese, and the historical memory of Korea was also wiped by them. Japanese officials in Korea during the occupation. Japanese took over Korea's labor and nearly 100,000 Japanese families settled in Korea with the land they had been given by the Korean. They had taken actually, and they chopped all the Korean trees and by the millions, and they planted the non-native spices. The Japanese wants to transfer a transform a familiar landscape into something that the Korean cannot recognize. And nearly 725,000 Korean workers, they were made to work in Japan and its other colonies, and as World War II, Japan forced hundreds of thousands of Korean women into life as comfort women. They were using the women for the sexual slaves, and they were women had to serve in the military brothels in the Japanese military brothels. They had to be served as a sexual slave. The Korean women, they had to do like that. And the Korean peoples were not the only thing that were plundered during the Japanese colonization. Its cultural symbols were considered the fair game too, and one of the most powerful symbols of Korean sovereignty and independence was its royal palace in Seoul, Gyeongbokgung, which was built in Seoul in 1395 by the mighty Joseon dynasty. Soon after assuming power, the Japanese colonial government tore down over a third of the complex history building, and the remaining structure were thrown into the tourist attraction for the Japanese visitor. If they were just changed, the palace were changed to the historical place, and it was only the tourist place for the Japanese visitors. Even the Korean were not allowed it to visit or like that. Japanese were trying to do the things to make the things new. To they wants to transfer everything so that they wanted to transfer everything so that the Korean couldn't recognize their stuffs. That's why Japanese were doing like that. And as historian Hee Jong-han, the imperial government also attempted to preserve treasures of Korean art, history, and culture. But then he used them to uphold Imperial Japan's image of itself as a civilizing and modern force. And this view of Korea as backward and primitive compared to Japan, and made it into textbook, museum, and even Koreans' own perception of themselves. And shrine of 1000 estate, the Shinto shrine, which was built in 1925 from the forced Korean donation, still remains, but it is used as a city park. And the occupation government also worked to assimilate the Koreans with the help of language, religion, and education. Shinto shrines, originally intended for Japanese families, became place of forced worship, and the colonial government made Koreans worship as the god of Imperial Japan, including the dead emperors and the spirits of war heroes who had helped them to conquer the Korea earlier in the century, and it was explained by the historian Donald, the writer. So this forced worship was viewed as an act of cultural genocide by many Koreans, but for the colonists it was seen as evidence that Koreans and Japanese were a single and ununified people. Though some families got around the Shinto ethic by simply visiting the shrines and not praying there, others grudgingly adopted the new religious practices out of fear. Also, Japan had even waged war on people's family names, the Korean people's family name. At first, the colonial government made it illegal for people to adopt a Japanese-style name, ostensibly to prevent confusion in family registers. But in 1939, the government made the changing name on, like, they made it the official rule, like, policy. So under the law, Korean families were graciously allowed to choose the Japanese surname. They had to choose the Japanese surname before it was illegal, but by 1939 government also made it like official rule. That's why they were it was mandatory also for Korean. So at least 84% of all Koreans took on the name, since people who lacked the Japanese name were not recognized by the colonial bureaucracy and were shut out of everything from mail delivery to ration card. So the people who were like not putting the Japanese name were like not recognized by the colonial bureaucracy also, and they had to be neglected or they couldn't get the service like mail delivery to the ration card. The whole point was for the government to be able to say the people that had changed their names voluntarily during the Japanese occupation time. So even though Japan occupied Korea for an entire generation, the Korean people didn't submit passively to Japanese rule. Throughout the occupation, protest movement pushed the Korean people for Korean independence. In 1919, the March 1st movement proclaimed Korean independence and more than like 1,500 demonstrations broke out. The protests were brutally suppressed by the Japanese, but not before the desire for independence swept through Korea. So, uh, like some of the 80,000 Korean gathering to commemorate the Korean independence. They want the advancement and the protection of their ancient culture and national identity from foreign influence, which was like Japanese. And they want the fostering of the independence movement during the colonial um, Korea and legacy of nationalism. The movement demonstrates the willingness for Koreans to take to the street against the colonial power. Even Japanese tried to occupy Korea, but Korean people were like passively against the Japanese rule. They want to have their own identity and own culture. They want to preserve their own identity and culture and so on, and they want to provide the catalyst for Koreans to publicize their grievances and aspirations. And Japan wants to control Korea and